What if the most revolutionary idea of the 21st century was born out of heartbreak? In 2003, a socially awkward Harvard sophomore sits down at his computer after a failed date, angry, rejected, and burning with the need to prove something. That night, Mark Zuckerberg writes the code for a crude site that rates women on campus. What starts as a controversial prank quickly spirals into a digital empire that would reshape how the world connects. The social network isn't just the story of how Facebook was created, it's a sharp, fast-paced dive into friendship, betrayal, genius, and ambition. As power shifts and lawsuits fly, we watch one brilliant coder's meteoric rise, and the personal cost of chasing something cooler than cool. How does the story go? Let's follow the storyline. The film begins in a bar, where Mark is chatting with his girlfriend Erica, telling her that there are many genius students in China. Of his good grades and his desire to join an exclusive university club, like Phoenix or Porcelain. As he continues to talk to her about the subject, and in an arrogant way, the young woman gets upset and cuts off the relationship. This makes Mark angry and accuses her of being unfaithful. Erica can't stand it and insults her to leave him later. Mark then returns angry to Kirkland, his university case, and sits in front of his computer to post a post talking badly of Erica. After being a little drunk from the beer, he enters the office of his house, and realizes that the photos of the students are scary. In addition, a certain Olsen has put each photo next to an animal. This makes him think of the idea of hacking photos of all the university houses, and then do the same as Olsen, but this time between two girls. After hours, Mark gets all the photos, and when his friend Eduardo arrives, he asks him for the algorithm to qualify girls. When everything is ready, Mark sends it to a couple of students, who, when they see it, make their vote, and their classmates begin to spread it, creating a great chain that circulates throughout the university. At the same time, Erica finds out about Mark's post, and she starts to feel bad, because the students start to make fun of her. Meanwhile, the traffic has begun to saturate the networks, so Eduardo asks Mark to cancel it so that he doesn't get into trouble, but his friend doesn't listen to him. After a while, they call the security guard, and inform him that Harvard's network is very saturated. Minutes go by, and it ends up collapsing. Days later, Mark is taken to a hearing, for breaking the security network and creating the face match site to distribute unauthorized images. Mark in his defense claims that he already apologized, and in breaking the security, they should congratulate him since he found gaps in the system. When he leaves, he lets Eduardo know that he was punished with 6 months of academic observation. On the other hand, a student named Divya Narendra meets two twins, Tyler and Cameron Winklevoss, and shows them the news about what Mark did. Seeing the great traffic he made on his website, the friends agree to hire him. Days go by, and Mark meets the twins Winklevoss and Divya, who ask him to work for them as a programmer on an exclusive Harvard dating site. In addition, if he succeeds, he will be able to clean his image. Mark, without thinking, accepts it. Sometime later, we realize that Mark is in demand for the twins and Divya, confirming that he promised to help them create the website. Meanwhile, in another lawsuit from his friend Eduardo, he confirms that he mentioned the idea of creating Facebook at a fraternity party. That day, Mark arrived at the party, and after learning that Eduardo was invited to the Phoenix Club, he told him that his page was not successful because of the sexy girl, but because the students already knew them. This gave him the idea of creating a new page where they only include university friends. In addition, people were free to provide the information they wanted. Eduardo then found out that Mark chose him because he had money, since he asked him for $1,000 for the servers. In addition, he was going to place him as a financial manager and with earnings of 30% of the total, not knowing that Mark was already planning to get him out of a company that was not yet created, just out of envy of seeing him at the Phoenix Club. Returning to the lawsuit of the twins and Divya, Eduardo, who is a witness, declares that Mark was not going to make them the Harvard page, because they had almost nothing and he didn't want to waste his time. He didn't even care about cleaning his reputation, since at that time, he was famous for having created Face Match. The plaintiff's lawyer then shows evidence that Mark worked on Facebook, and apparently made the twins believe that Divya worked at Harvard Connection, but avoided any meeting with them. After weeks of creating Facebook, Eduardo tells Mark that Phoenix selected him for the next round, so the next night he meets another group of students for their final test. The days go by, and Mark manages to register the Facebook page, and then sends a message to the twins, telling them that their page is not capable of maintaining an acceptable functionality, leaving the project. But 42 days had already passed in which he had not mentioned that there was a failure. Weeks later, a student looks for Mark to ask him if a certain girl has a boyfriend or if he knows if he likes someone. This makes the young man have an idea, so he goes to his computer and adds to his invention the sentimental situation, since the purpose of the application will be to sleep with someone, telling Eduardo that the page is ready. Then they place Eduardo as co-founder and financial manager. He also asks for the emails of the Phoenix to send them the link. Eduardo doubts it, but ends up giving it to him. In that, the page is published, and the friends prepare to celebrate. Hours later, Divya finds out that the page is on the internet, and quickly goes to look for the twins to tell them that Mark stole their website, and while they call their lawyer, they find out that the site is exclusive for Harvard students, just as they had previously planned. Hanging up, Divya mentions that Mark denied her in the emails she sent them, but the twins do not intend to sue him because they are Harvard gentlemen, and they must take care of their reputation. In the hearing, Mark mentions that he knew that the twins had a rich father, but he did not ask them for the $1,000 because he wanted his best friend Eduardo to be his partner. But then, he is surprised to learn that he was also sued by him. Divya mentions that he became very well known on Facebook, and Mark became the most important man at the university. Returning to the story, Mark and Eduardo attend a Gates conference, where two girls recognize them and are left to go out with them. Upon arriving in the room, Eduardo proposes to Mark to monetize Facebook with ads, but he does not accept because the pop-ups can bother users. Then he finds the claim of the twins and Divya for having stolen them from Facebook, but Mark does not care because no code of them is on the page. Night falls, and in a club, Christy ends up with Eduardo and Mark with his friend, and while they wait for them, Mark notices that Erica is also in that plaque. So he approaches her to talk to her about Facebook and ask her to talk for a while, but she does not accept since he treated her very badly. She is also with her friends and wishes her luck with her video game. Mark returns to his friend and tells him that they must expand. Upon arriving at his room, he proposes to take Facebook to the universities of Yale, Columbia and Stanford, appointing his programmer Dustin to write the codes with 5% participation, and Chris for advertising with earnings according to his work. Meanwhile, the twins agree to sue Mark when he finds out that he violated the laws of his university. On the other hand, in Stanford, a young man named Sean Parker wakes up with a student, telling him that he was the founder of a music page called Napster. And when he tries to check his email, he finds out from Facebook, so he plans to meet as soon as possible with Mark. Meanwhile, the twins go in search of the rector, to tell them that Mark violated the rules of the university, by stealing his idea of millions of dollars. But the man tells them that the rules are for the institution, and not between students, giving them the option to invent another project, and if they don't like it, they can go to court. In his complaint, Eduardo mentions that he traveled to New York to meet with possible advertisers, paid with the $1,000 he invested in the company, but the appointments were terrible because Mark was sleeping. In addition, there was one more dinner, where they were going to meet with Sean Parker, but Eduardo felt uncomfortable because the young man had a bad reputation. Moments later, Sean arrives and tells them about his life, and adds excesses and friends who became millionaires. In addition, he tells Mark that he should travel to California, and knowing about Facebook, he tells them not to think about millions, but about thousands of millions. At the end, he pays the bill and is left to call Mark, telling him before leaving that Facebook is better than Facebook. In the hearing, the lawyer reminds Mark that when creating the company, he had 65, 30 Eduardo, and 5 Dustin. The lawyer asks Eduardo if he ever did something that harmed the company, mentioning later that he was accused of cruelty to animals. That day, an article appeared that mentioned it, but Eduardo declares that the accusation was just to take care of a hen, which was part of his initiation in the Phoenix Club, and all he did was feed her with chicken since she didn't have to eat. That day, Mark told him that he needed more money, since they will move to California and hire 2 passers-by. This bothers Eduardo because he thinks that the plans are being made with Sean Parker, since he proposed to go to that place. Hours later, Mark sets up a competition to find the programmer he needs. In that, Eduardo arrives and gives him an envelope, mentioning that he opened a new account and deposited $18,000 to the company. The lawyer makes him confirm that he deposited a total of $19,000 to the company. Eduardo confirms it, since $1,000 was for the first servers, and he did it because he thought they were partners and wanted to cooperate. Already installed in California, Mark receives Sean's visit, who congratulates him by telling him that he made the right decision. But when he enters, he does not find Eduardo, so Mark tells him that he is having fun in New York. Hours later at the disco, Sean advises him that no one else should manipulate his company. In addition, Eduardo should focus on Facebook and not on anything else. He even proposes to enter 2 continents and not 100 universities as he wants to do. Mark starts to think, and offers to give him a room in case he has nowhere to sleep. Days later, at the end of a remorse competition, the twins and Divya find out that Facebook is already in some countries in England, so this time, they decide to send Mark with their resources. A few weeks later, Eduardo arrives in California and finds out that Sean is living in the house. In addition, he has noticed very young girls who seem to have consumed. When he sees Mark, he takes him aside to talk to him, telling him that he left the party and went away from Christy because she is crazy. Mark mentions that in that place, Facebook is growing very fast. In addition, with Sean, they have managed to expand more by making appointments. Eduardo mentions that he was also doing that in New York, but apparently he did not get any client. The next day, Eduardo returns to New York, freezing all his accounts linked to Facebook. Meanwhile, Mark and Sean meet an investor named Peter Thiel, who offers them $500,000 to start, but first asks them who Eduardo Saverin is. Nights later, Christy arrives at Eduardo's room and argues with him because he did not notify him when he arrived. Also on Facebook, he is as single, in that Mark calls him to ask him why he froze the account, adding that with that he could have destroyed Facebook. But then, he tells him that Peter invested $500,000 in the company and wants to meet him because he also needs his signature. Moments later, Christy arrives and Eduardo ends with her. Upon arriving at the new offices, Eduardo finds out that they eliminated the old shares to create new ones. In addition, they increased their participation by 35%, so that he can put new investors. Mark reduced his participation to 51%, because he does not care much about money and needs protection. Dustin and Sean at 6%, and Peter at 7%. In the hearing, the lawyer asks Eduardo if he knew that when signing that document he was going to be convicted. The young man complains because he thought they were his lawyers. Even Mark congratulated him and asked him to return to the university, promising to call him at the million-member party. Eduardo mentions that months later he was invited to the million party, but before he had to attend a meeting. Upon arriving at the new office, he realized that there was none of that, if they did not give him more contracts to sign. But this time, he read them and found out that there were new investors. So it was for Mark, asking him where all the shares he sold came from, and then he mentions to the lawyer that his shares were the only ones they manipulated, until he left it at 0.03%. At that moment, Mark washes his hands, telling him that he was finance manager if he should see the deals he made. Eduardo does not accept to sign anything, and promises to return with lawyers to take everything away from him, asking him if he did it out of envy of seeing him in Phoenix. He even thinks he planned the chicken thing. Upon leaving, Sean stops him by giving him the $19,000 he invested in the company. But Eduardo does not receive it. Mark is not so happy about what Sean did, but the young man tries to calm him down by telling him that they are already in the big leagues. They will also have a party for the $1 million, and minutes later they reach their goal. Night falls and the party is held, but minutes later the police appear, arresting Sean with remains of narcotics. In addition, the young people who are with him confess that they are minors, but do not worry because he already paid the bail. In addition, he does not know who sent the narcotics, but Mark is worried because the girls will be passers-by and can bring them problems, telling him to go home because he will take care of it. In the lawsuit, Mark mentions to the lawyer that Sean is still the owner, with 7% of the company. In addition, he lets him know that he is not bad. The woman tells him that they will give him an agreement. He will also have to pay the jury so that they do not speak anything, adding that they will believe that he planned the chicken thing. Then he asks him why he was not at Sean's party, and when he sees Mark hesitating, he assures him that it is better to pay. The young man stayed in the office for a while, and then sent an application to Erica. The twins received $65 million and signed a non-disclosure agreement, competed in the Beijing Games, and reached 6th place. Eduardo received an unknown agreement. In addition, his name was put back as co-founder in the Facebook header, ending the film. The Social Network is a film that, although it tries to confuse us with its mixture of history and lawsuits, it keeps us intrigued because we do not know what will happen. In addition, it does not have any scene that is filler, since they are all important in the plot, from the hand of the good performances of Jesse, Andrew, and Justin, well-structured characters, since each one has their own problems and dreams. All this wrapped in an excellent adaptation of a real story. Highly recommended. Thank you for watching.